we're obviously going to be talking. The news just doesn't end. It's been a very busy week in foreign policy. As we know, or probably as you all know, President Trump met with Ukrainian President Zelensky, as well as a group of European leaders just days after his summit with Vladimir Putin that took place in Russia. The stakes could not be higher. And while I've been reading that people left this meeting this afternoon in an upbeat way, it seems to me, I know I do match the pillows. I didn't plan that, you all. I just got out of the shower, so my hair's wet. Sorry about that. And anyway, it seems to me that they might be talking past each other. But whenever there's news about Ukraine or Russia, I am so lucky to know the former U.S. ambassador to Russia. I have tremendous respect for Michael McFaul. And he's got a new book out, by the way, in October. And I think the title says it all: Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. So I can't wait to talk to him about what's been going on. So let me just search his name. I hope you all are doing well. And here we go. Here's Mike McFaul. He's a professor at Stanford, one of the smartest people I know. He has met with Vladimir Putin on a number of occasions. I think he knows the region probably better than anyone. And so I was really delighted that he was willing to talk to me. Now I'm staying at a friend's house, and I hope the Wi-Fi is good here. It's looking good. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm so happy to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Sure.
Can I mention that I'm so sorry about your brother, only because this is a disease that has affected me so deeply.
Sure, I know, of course.
Mike's younger brother passed away from colon cancer last week, and anyway, I'm just so sorry to hear that. And I just think it's an important reminder that people need to get screened for this disease because it's very
Yes.
preventable, and has a 93% cure rate if it's detected early. But
Right.
I know what he went through. I know what his family went through, and I'm just so sorry.
Appreciate that. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah. Gosh, we have so much to unpack right now. I want to go backwards only because I want to set the scene if we can,
Sure.
Mike, in terms of today's meeting. Let's talk about Friday's meeting first and foremost. We
Okay.
were scheduled to have a conversation. Obviously, you couldn't do that on Friday because of your brother, but I'm curious, as someone who has participated in these high level talks, what your impressions were of this meeting with President Trump and Vladimir Putin.
Well, lots of impressions, and you're right. I have been kind of the point person, especially when I worked at the White House for President Obama to arrange meetings with Russian presidents, both Putin and Medvedev. He was the president back when I was there. And I would just say there are a lot of things that were different about this meeting than what I would call standard operating procedure. So first, the normal procedure is that summits of that nature, especially with all that, red carpets and planes and all that, they generally take place at the end of big negotiations. And in the process leading up to it, there's, lower level officials like me and other people prepare documents, prepare agreements. In one case, we negotiated the New START Treaty in 2010 with the Russians. That took about a year and a half of negotiations. And then we held the summit, right? We flew to Prague. The two presidents got together. They signed that agreement. And by the way, we got rid of 30% of the nuclear weapons in the world that day, right? Win-win for both sides, win-win for the world. What was different about this is it was meet first with no negotiations, no agreements ahead of time. So that was odd. Second, you know, diplomats, presidents, secretaries of state, they always have to deal with autocrats from time to time to get things done that are good for the American people, right? That's part of the job. But one of my mentors here at Stanford, he was a former Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan, George Shultz. George used to always say, you got to do these meetings, but you don't check your values at the door. And what was strange to me was that President Trump was treating this dictator at home who's murdered two of my personal friends. Just so maybe I'm a little biased, but he's murdered Alexei Navalny, he's murdered Boris Nemtsov, and he's put in jail lots of other people. He then launched this imperial war of annexation against Ukraine, first in 2014, and then he expanded it in 2022. That's the first time since Hitler and Stalin have there been full-scale invasions and occupations and annexation in Europe. So that puts him in another category. And yet, and he's the same guy that's taken thousands of Ukrainian children, kidnapped them, terrorizes Ukrainian civilians every single night. The night before they've met, more Ukrainians died. And yet President Trump just treated him like they were best friends, right? There was none of this. It was just normalizing imperialism, I guess is the way I put it, normalizing dictatorship, normalizing an indicted war criminal. And you can meet with difficult autocrats without doing all that. So that was the second impression I had. But then the third impression is, okay, well, maybe I'm just biased because I prefer democracy over dictators and I like freedom over not, and I prefer good over evil. Okay, I got that. I'm just, the realpolitik, people would say McFaul's just too much of an idealist or something. Okay. But but if you're going to be the transactional leader that Trump claims he is, the art of the deal guy, what did he get out of it? What's the transaction? As far as I can tell, we got nothing out of that meeting that advances American national interests. And I want to really stress that. The President of the United States' job is to advance our national interests and our allies and our partners. And I don't see, in the State Department, we used to call these deliverables. There was not a concrete deliverable out of that meeting. Now, afterwards, they tried to spin it. The president's special envoy, Mr. Witkoff, said afterwards that they got Putin to agree to security guarantees. And then the Russians denounced that today. They said that wasn't true.
And what does that mean exactly, security guarantees?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because this a very amorphous word that doesn't mean anything unless it's specified. So the idea is, and the Ukrainians have focused on this for all these negotiations for a long time, they might be prepared to give up territory. Or let me be more precise. They might be prepared to only unify their country through peaceful means. They're never going to say this is your land, but they might say that. But they want to do that in return for a permanent peace, not just one that lasts for a couple years and then Putin invades again. And that's what happened to them before, right? They've had those kind of guarantees before and they were invaded again. So they want something greater than that. The conversation that's taking place as we're talking at the White House is about what our European colleagues are calling Article 5 like security guarantees. And Article 5 is of the NATO treaty that says an attack on one is an attack on all. And the idea behind that would be, therefore, if Ukraine was attacked in the future, that those participating in this new security guarantee agreement would in essence, go to war with Russia. That's what they're discussing. But, I look at that. Why NATO light when you can have NATO, right? I just think, and no, I want to be clear. This is just my views. I know President Trump doesn't agree, but I think a really breakthrough idea would be to negotiate with the Russians about where the borders are and to acquiesce for them to continue to occupy some part of Ukrainian territory. And that happens on day one. And then day two, the NATO leaders, they meet in Brussels and they say, we are inviting Ukraine to join. And I said day one, day two, because those things should not be together. Putin doesn't get to have a vote about who we get to ally with or not. That's none of his business. But I think that would be a really breakthrough, enduring peace. And then if Trump did that, yes, he should get his Nobel Peace Prize. That's not going to happen because he's already taken that off the table. And that's part of the strange thing about Trump's just diplomacy 101. Just, you have cards. Like, I've negotiated with the Russians, right? On multiple hard negotiations. You come in and you have things you might trade, but you trade them. You like, okay, I'll give you this. For instance, we'll recognize Crimea, but then you give me this. And the odd part about Trump's negotiating style is he just keeps playing cards without getting anything in return. So over the weekend, he said no NATO membership for Ukraine, and Ukraine has to give up Crimea. I just think he should try to play those cards for something of value.
Well, can we talk about this land, this region that's in question, that that Putin wants to become part of Russia, right? I mean, he
Yes,
wants to take it back from Ukraine. It's called the Donbas region, right?
yes.
Or that area. It's eastern Ukraine. I wish I had a map here, but I'd love for you, Mike, to explain to everyone what that region means to Ukraine. And I'm surprised, but I mean, what do I know? I'm not a negotiator, and I'm certainly not an expert in this part of the world, that Ukraine is considering ceding that territory to Russia.
Well, those are great questions, and I don't have great answers. Just to think of, for everybody watching in your mind, there's four regions. Think of them as states, like the American states, right? So there's four regions uh, that most of the fighting has been taking place in. And each of those four regions are partially occupied by the Russians today. And one of those pieces, almost 90%, right? And so 2 years ago, Putin held a big ceremony where he said these new four regions are now part of the Russian Federation, in addition to Crimea, which he annexed back in 2014, right? So five regions of Russia, five states, if you will, of the Ukrainian country. Putin has already, de jure annexed, not de facto, de jure. Um, and
What's the
he want
difference?
One is just on paper and one is in reality. So on paper, he had a big ceremony, there's parades in the Kremlin, and they say he had all these fictitious leaders from these places saying, you're now a part of Russia, right? But de facto, on the ground, in reality, he doesn't control any of those places 100%. Um, so to the best of our understanding, because we never really got a good readout from what happened in Alaska, but to the best of our understanding, what Putin asked for in Alaska, pretty audacious. He said Donbas, that's two of those regions, right? That's up in the northeast corner. He said, Mr. President, convince Zelensky to leave Donbas. And remember, Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainians now hold parts of Donbas as we speak, right? Just got a photo from one of my friends who was there just 3 days ago. It's Ukrainian held territory. And Putin says, you got to convince Zelensky to give me those two regions. And in return, I will stop fighting in those other two regions that I just mentioned, right? Kherson and Zaporizhia is what they're called. So that's his deal. That's his offer. And the Ukrainians, I talked to many Ukrainians afterwards. I mean, this is nonsense from them. The idea that they would give up territory that hasn't even been conquered is just a non-starter. But that's what Putin asked for on Friday.
So we move your phone down just a teeny bit,
Oh,
Mike.
whoops,
Yeah.
whoops,
Yeah.
whoops.
That's
I let it
perfect.
slide.
Thank you. No, that's perfect. So that's what Putin wants. And you're saying that Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials, as well as the Ukrainian people, think that's outrageous, that they control those two regions right now. So it's before we talk about the possibility of giving that over to Putin and what that would mean, in terms of emboldening Putin for other potential invasions in the future. Um, that region is particularly rich in minerals, is it not? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about Donbas, those two regions put
Yeah.
together, and what they mean to Ukraine?
Yeah, Donbas is rich in minerals. It's the industrial base of the country. So I think it's like 8 or 9% of the population before, the first war started in 2014. But it's more like 15% of the GDP of the entire country. So would be a tremendous loss to Ukraine. That is true. It's also parts of it have been occupied de facto by Russian surrogates since 2014. And another important thing to realize is that once that happened, many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians left that territory. Right? They're living all over the place. I have friends from those regions that are living in Germany, living here in the United States, and living in other parts of Ukraine. And I say that because Zelensky has never said this, and I will never want to get ahead of him. This is for him and them. They're the people of Ukraine to decide. But I think the part that was occupied since 2014 is a part that Ukrainian people and President Zelensky could live with giving up. Again, I want to stress they're not going to recognize it as part of Russia, but they could recognize that they will only seek reunification through peaceful means. That's the language, and they're de facto that means that in reality it would be under Russia, as long as Putin's in power. And but they're only going to do that if they have some guarantee from the West that by doing that, they get something in return for their security. And so when you hear this phrase, land for peace, the Ukrainians keep saying, well, yeah, you guys keep asking us for land, but you never say what the peace part is. And that is what the conversation at the White House today is I think, principally focused on.
And is making Ukraine a member of NATO just off the table completely? You were saying that President Trump doesn't want that to happen, but is that still potentially part of these negotiations, or is that a non starter in your view?
I personally do not think it's a non-starter. And I think it's a big, big mistake for Americans and for President Trump and Secretary Rubio to frame it as a non-starter. Because here's why I think that. Let's say that my day one, day two scenario, right? So let's say on day one that Zelensky acquiesces. He agrees with, he doesn't want to, but he agrees. Okay, wherever the Russian soldiers are today, we're not going to try to keep fighting them. We're going to let the Russians stay there for the foreseeable future, and we're going to try through peaceful means, through a long process. Think about West Germany, East Germany, right? Divided for decades. That's going to be our process moving forward. That's Putin's best day of his life. That's what he's been trying to get for the last 11 years. That puts him in the history books next to Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, as one of the Russian leaders that expanded the Russian Empire. He'll have his parades, Xi Jinping and all the other dictators of the world can come to Red Square to celebrate that fact. So the next day, that's the day that NATO says, all right, the rest of Ukraine is now in NATO.
Right.
Putin is not going to invade Ukraine that day. He just achieved the most important thing to him in his life. Why would he screw it up by going back to war? By the way, he's already has a million casualties. His economy is in a mess. So I just think this assessment, and I'm not saying I know Putin better than everybody, but I do. I know a lot about Putin. I've dealt with him for a long time. Katie, we met in 1991. That's how far back Putin and I go. We are not Facebook friends, but I've known him for a long time. They just keep making this assumption that this is some kind of non-starter. I completely disagree with that. And I would just like to remind everybody listening, when we created um, NATO in 1949, we did not ask for Stalin's permission. When we allowed West Germany to join in 1955, we didn't ask for Khrushchev's permission. When George W. Bush expanded NATO to the Baltic states. He didn't call up Putin and say, "Is this okay for you?" So I don't understand why we're giving Putin a veto over that decision. But that's my view. I want to really stress that unfortunately President Trump doesn't agree with me.
Well, isn't that a massive red flag, though, Mike, when you think about it? If Putin is so afraid of Ukraine being a part of NATO and having NATO support the country in the event of any other, malevolent actions on the part of Russia, that he potentially has designs on other parts of Ukraine or other countries in the region.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So first with Ukraine, the reason why I'm still remain pessimistic is that everything that Putin says is he still wants those four territories that we were talking about earlier, right? Eastern Ukraine. He hasn't achieved that yet. And he wants Ukraine to be at least subjugated to Russia because he doesn't think that Ukraine's an independent country or independent nation. Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. That's his view. I've heard him talk about it personally. I've been in the room when he talks that way. And maximally, he wants to bring it all into Russia. So tragically, I think the only way he negotiates seriously is when he's stopped on the battlefield and his armies cannot march further west.
Isn't this a kind of modern appeasement?
Yes. Yeah, I think right now that's the right way to talk about it. Now I want to remain hopeful. I hope that all those European leaders that are at the White House today who do not believe in appeasement, and some of them I know personally, will help to convince the president that that's a bad strategy. And it's even a bad strategy for you, President Trump, for your own legacy, for your own stature in the world. I hope they'll be able to do that. I think it's really a good thing that it's not just Zelensky and Trump in the room, that he has all those leaders there. I think that's a useful thing, but that's a hope. That's not a prediction.
Uh, Do you think that, I mean, since you're one of the few people who know Putin and who knows Putin and who's spent time with him and observed him in these situations, um, it's been a very strange dynamic between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin for a long time, right? Do you
Yes.
think, I mean, do you think that Donald Trump is being played by Putin? He went in wanting saying that there would be consequences if there wasn't a ceasefire. He pretty much threw that out the window, pretty quickly.
Yes.
What do you think Putin's attitude is towards Donald Trump?
That's a great question. Um, Honestly, I think he thinks of Trump as being just a really weak leader, and with a little bit of praise, and a little bit of repeating things that are false that Trump wants to hear, he can win him over. That's what happened in Alaska, right? So in Alaska, Putin said, "I would have never invaded Ukraine had you been president." Um, and that's exactly what Trump wanted to hear. And then behind closed doors, as we learned later in his conversation with Sean Hannity, Putin went on and on about how the 2020 elections was stolen because of mail-in ballot, because of mail-in voting, right? Uh, and I just listened to the president talk about that, and I can't believe that he would be so gullible, honestly. I guess I should get used to it by now, but what an absurd thing for him to claim. How does Putin know that that happened and no credible American organization, no investigative journalists have uncovered that, but somehow mysteriously the president of Russia knows that it was stolen because there was mail-in voting. And yet the president just repeated that, and he just that's how Putin has won him over. And I think more substantively, what happened is that, and I'm guessing, right? Because remember, we didn't get the other thing that was very strange about the summit, by the way, is again, I plan these, and there's the small meeting, then there's the large meeting. Oftentimes, there's a meal. The Russians, by the way, are really serious about these meals. It's usually a very serious thing. I got in big trouble one time when I switched a dinner for President Obama at the Kremlin to a luncheon, you would have thought the world was going to end when the president wanted to have dinner with his family, and he said, "Can we move it to a lunch?" And they were like apoplectic. The world is going to end. So, and then there was the press conference, but there weren't any of those things, right? There was a short meeting, no lunch, and then the press conference. Uh, didn't really happen. But the other thing that happens in a normal meeting is that senior administration officials, SAOs, that's what they're called, from the White House, I used to play this role often when I worked at the White House, then call up journalists and tell them about what were the good things that happened in the meeting. The fact that they didn't do any of those things, they took no questions. And I don't have to tell you, you know how much President Trump loves questions. He loves those press conferences. He goes on and on and on. I get tired watching him sometimes, but he goes on and on. He canceled that, and then there was from talking to my journalist friends who are in Alaska, there was no reaching out because I don't think they wanted to report on what actually happened in that meeting where President Trump actually began to accept the talking points of Putin. And I can tell you, Putin is an effective interlocutor. He is an effective speaker. He will go on and on about Russian history. He'll spin it in his own way. And if you don't know, what happened in the 15th century, and most even I don't, so most presidents don't. It's hard to follow. In one meeting with Obama, he went on for 58 minutes in the beginning of the meeting before President Obama even had the chance to speak. So that's the way he rolls. I just fear that Trump accepted his, perverse notion of history, and then, that's what he's now trying to explain to the European leaders today.
So fast forward. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention there were Russian attacks in two cities in Kharkiv, and I don't know how to pronounce. Is it Zapora? How do you?
Zaporizhia.
Thank you.
It's a
Uh,
mouthful. Yeah.
yeah, and at least 10 people were killed, including a child. And this was before the meetings. It injured dozens of others. Uh, you know, Zelensky condemned the strikes as a deliberate attempt to put pressure on Ukraine in
Yes.
the meetings. But, I think we didn't really talk about why a ceasefire is so important to set the table for some kind of solution,
Yes.
an agreement. Can you explain that as somebody who's such an experienced diplomat?
Well, it is oftentimes we call them in diplomacy confidence building member. What's constant CBMs, confidence building measures, CBMs, as a way to try to create a better atmosphere for negotiations, right? I mean, think about if Zelensky has to sit across the table from Putin and just a few hours ago, he's just slaughtered some of his citizens, that doesn't create a good atmosphere for negotiation. Number two, somehow let me back up. Going into the meeting, Trump said, "This is my goal for the meeting in Alaska." And it's his words, not mine. There are lots of clips of him saying that. And for reasons I do not understand, he just accepted Putin's position that we can't have a ceasefire until we have a full scale agreement. And there's I've been looking at the data. I don't see any causal relationship between ceasefire gets in the way of a full scale peace agreement. That's just an absurd argument that Putin made to Trump and now Trump's making. And I just want to be crystal clear about it. We're talking about people here. We're talking about lives. If they could have agreed to a ceasefire on Friday, more Ukrainians would be alive today. And every day we delay it, every day that Putin lobs in these rockets and these drones and kills almost always civilians. I want to underscore that it's almost always civilians. Why should we put up with that? And I hope the Chancellor of Germany in the press spray, when they were all sitting around the room, he brought this issue up. I applaud him for doing that. There is no reason that they couldn't agree to a ceasefire literally this week. And it could even be a more minimal one. Just let's stop attacking civilians, right? that I think would help to create momentum towards a more serious set of negotiations.
I wanted to ask you about the European leaders who are present, among them, lots of them: UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Macron, Italy's is it Giorgia Meloni? I mean,
Yes,
they all flew to as a show of solidarity for Zelensky, and also to kind of help, I think, shore him up and to provide some counterpoint to Donald Trump. Um, I guess the question is, how effective will they be? I guess we don't really know, Mike, yet. But how is this going to impact the U.S. relationship with Europe, which is already, slightly tenuous given
right.
tariffs and everything that's happened in the first 6 months of the Trump administration?
Yeah. Again, another great question that I don't have a great answer to. I do think it helps to have them all there. Whosever idea that was, I applaud them because that doesn't make it just Zelensky versus Trump. It makes it about European security with our NATO allies there. If it's just Zelensky Trump, Trump's immediately reminded of the first time he was impeached, right? It was that phone call, and he just can't get over that, even though that was a long time ago. This makes it less about that. And I did watch the press spray on TV, and I was live on TV commenting on it, and uh, Trump was in a good mood. He was saying nice things about them all, and then they all rightfully said nice things about him. Creates a good music, and he loves sitting there, with everybody at his house and his offices. You could see that he liked that, so that's a good thing. And then there's a couple of special guests, just to get into the weeds a bit. The Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, she does have a special relationship with the president. They're kind of, illiberal nationalist types. They have a kind of similar um, political place on the spectrum in their countries, but she is very pro-Ukrainian, unlike the MAGA base for Trump. So that's useful. It just shows you can be, a populist nationalist and also be pro-Ukrainian, and she's got that rapport with him. And then the president of Finland is there too, Alex Stubb, who I've known for many years, even when he had different jobs. Extremely talented politician. He was the foreign minister before, prime minister before. And you know what else? He is an excellent golfer. Uh,
Oh,
he he had a scholarship to play golf here in the United States when he was a college kid, and he played golf with the president. And the president was impressed by his golf prowess. And over that, they bonded. So that's another, why is the president of Finland there? Partly he's there because of the sad history of what the Soviets did to his country in 1940, where they had to give up territory to get peace. But I think he's really there because he's a personal friend of President Trump.
so interesting how emotional intelligence and these kind of personal dynamics
Yes.
play out in these situations. So just kind of to end things, and I'd love to follow up once we figure out
Yeah.
what they've decided, Mike, since
Yeah. Let's do that.
we're flying blind a little
Yeah.
bit
We're
here.
midstream right now. Right. Yeah.
But let's just say, theoretically, taking a step back and looking at the big picture, if in fact this territory is ceded to Russia, and for whatever reason, and by the way, why couldn't NATO just say, screw the United States? We're inviting Ukraine to be a part of NATO. We don't need Donald Trump to give his stamp of approval. Like, screw you, Trump. You're going to be a part of NATO. Ukraine, come.
Well, that would be great, except NATO works by consensus. And so one country can stop the admission of any member. And I mean, so the Ukrainians do, just so you know, Katie, they do joke about that. It's kind of dark humor, of course, but they say, well, once Trump leaves NATO, then we can join NATO. But I don't want that outcome. I think we're all better off if we're all in NATO. And by the way, I want to remind everybody that President Trump is only going to be president for another 3.5 years. I think we're sometimes we get we feel like we're in this world forever. I don't believe that for a moment. I have a very different view, and I have a different strategy for America in the long term in a post-Trump order. In fact, I just wrote a whole book about it. We'll get together and talk about it when it comes out in October.
Right, I
Um,
mentioned it at the top of this.
yeah, well, thanks. It's called Autocrats versus Democrats, and I hope we'll still be on the Democratic side in that moment. But I say all that because I don't want Trump to take off the table forever Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO. You know who else won't be president forever? Vladimir Putin won't be president forever. And so we've got to, maybe in the short term, the best that can be hoped for are these security, Article 5 light guarantees, right, that the Europeans might provide. And by the way, they're
It's being described, Mike, as a NATO-style security presence without committing U.S. troops.
right, right. That's the distinction, right. That's better than nothing. So I think that's progress. I should point out that in the last hour, the Russians have just categorically said they're against that. But again, I don't think they should not get a vote.
Well, do you think that ultimately that, you started this conversation talking about negotiations is you give up something, but you get something in return. Ultimately, what do you think Ukraine is going to get in return?
I hope two major things. One, the security guarantee that we've been talking about, where European soldiers are deployed on Ukrainian territory to help keep the peace. Peacekeepers, tripwire. I don't really like that word tripwire, but where they're there to just keep that border, right? And there are lots of countries in the world that's happened before. I mentioned before West Germany, East Germany. Think of Cyprus as another place. You've been to these borders, you see it, and the Cypriots never acknowledged the Turkish occupation of part of their island. They've never acknowledged that. But you can go to Cyprus now. It's a peaceful place. And you go up to the border and you see all the soldiers there and you see the barbed wire. That keeps the peace. That is a scenario that I think could be enduring. And the second that I think is not getting enough attention, but I hope they're discussing it today. Currently, we have in the West about $300 billion of Russian central bank assets and other Russian assets that are in our banks. They were correctly, brilliantly frozen by the G7. They agreed to freeze those assets back in 2022. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister of Canada, that came up with that idea. That was a really good thing. The next move, those assets have to be given to Ukraine. Uh, Americans don't want to pay for reconstruction. Europeans don't want to pay for it. That's money is sitting right there. I think that would be part of a sweetener that would help to make this very, very unattractive thing that Zelensky has to do. I mean, think about as a politician how hard it will be for him to say we're not going to keep fighting to try to bring back the land. And I want to emphasize, it's not just land. There's people living on that land. There are Ukrainian citizens under occupation today with the Russians, and the Russians do not treat them well. So for him to do that, he's got to have something else to give the Ukrainian people. Because if he doesn't, I worry there could literally be a coup d'etat inside Ukraine, where the soldiers say, we're not giving up. We're going to overthrow Zelensky and keep fighting. We're not giving up. We've lost too many of our sisters and brothers to give it away for nothing.
Well, I have a question. Who makes that decision about unfreezing those assets? I mean, who's in charge of that?
They could the leaders in the room right now at the White House, they could decide that today.
You
Now,
think they're discussing that, Mike?
I don't. I don't. Tragically, I don't. But that's why I want to keep mentioning it every time I get a chance, because and we've looked into it. I run a sanctions group. It's called the International Working Group on Russian Sanctions. We've been around for 3.5 years. We published our paper on this idea in October of 2022. We've talked to all the smartest lawyers in the world who have blessed the idea that this is legal. This notion that it's illegal is not true. I just think it takes political will to do it. So maybe it won't happen today, but it could happen. Literally, the people in the room today could make that decision.
How much money are we talking about in frozen assets?
We don't exactly know, but between 250 and $300 billion. Most of it is in Europe, by the way. We only have 5 to 10 in the United States. But in talking to Europeans about this just 2 weeks ago, they all say if Trump would take the first step, that would make it a lot easier for their countries and their banks to follow through.
Interesting. Real quickly, just two quick observations on sort of the atmospherics of all of this, Mike. Zelensky didn't wore a suit.
He did, in a brief, his own stylist too, from the same makers of his other outfits. And he did crack a joke. I thought it was very brave. He said, I have a different suit on, Mr. President, but you look like you have the same suit on because Trump wears the same suit and the same tie. I thought that was pretty gutsy given how badly the last one went. But that's true. He did have his suit on.
And also, someone mentioned I saw on social media that Hillary Clinton had said some kind words about Trump. But basically, what she said is that she would nominate Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize if he ends Ukraine war without giving territory to Russia.
Right. Yeah.
So that kind of sounds like when pigs fly, right?
uh, I would hope not, but I think in the coming years, I think that's near impossible. But I wonder, if my old boss, Secretary Clinton, would amend that if we could actually get a deal that provided the security guarantees for Ukraine and did not force them to give up territory that they still have under their control. That's not the deal that Secretary Clinton was asking for, but that would be a deal. Um, you know, that would be a good deal for all sides.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to watch how all this sort of shakes out, and the impact of all of it, and what it will do to Putin's psyche in terms of dissuading him and Russia writ large from trying to gain more territory in other parts, well, in the whole region itself. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to wonder what with this deal, how countries like Poland might feel about it, right, Mike?
Yes. Well, that's a really important. We got too much
I
into
think
the.
I should be a diplomat, Mike.
You
I'm
would be
asking so
great.
many good questions.
You would be great.
Kidding.
What country do you want to go to? We'll have
No,
to wait
thanks.
for
I'm
probably a
kidding.
new president. But we're so we've been talking so closely to what they're actually talking about. We're forgetting the meta point that you just made. This will reward war. This will reward imperial, um, barbaric invasion of neighbors. That's a horrible war. Katie, when I teach about this stuff here at Stanford, I start my introductory class with a map of Europe that shows 1,000 years of history that goes by in 6 minutes. And what you see in that map is you see the borders changing all the time, right? You see the Mongols come, then the Turks come, then Hitler comes, then Stalin comes, and you just see this movement all the time, land changing all the time. And then we get to 45 and it stops. And there's a little bit, we mentioned one of them, right? There's little pieces like Cyprus and things that happen in the Balkans. But by and large, we fought World War II to stop imperial wars of annexation. That was the whole point. And we did, the Cold War was not cold, but there wasn't annexation. There wasn't full scale invasion in Europe. And that was a tremendous achievement. And we are now on the verge of moving away from that. And that, I think, is really scary. And I hope we do it with the least amount of damage, but there's already been damage done. And you are absolutely right. The last time I was with leaders in that part of the world, with leaders from Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they are really worried that this doesn't stop in Ukraine, that the next time it could be them. And that's why it is so important that we stay united as a NATO alliance. That's why it's so great to see all those NATO allies at the White House today, and to remind everybody that Moscow, either the Soviets or the Russians, have never attacked a NATO country. So NATO expansion has helped to keep the peace, especially in places like the Baltic states. But also, NATO has never attacked the Soviet Union or Russia. And so we shouldn't buy into this argument that it's a threat to Russia. It's not a threat to Russia. I'm looking out the window, at my neighbor's house, right? If my neighbor builds a fence to protect his property, that fence only is threatening to me if I try to break into his house, right? If I'm not intending to break into his house, it's no threat to me. And that, I think, is the metaphor that we have to think about NATO as an alliance that preserves the peace rather than causes conflict.
I keep thinking about FDR and Churchill and World War II and the kind of leadership and diplomacy that took place then that really saved the world,
Yeah.
honestly, and how critically important it is to have that kind of leadership in a global crisis like this. And I think, the beginning of our conversation, you were talking about how unconventional all of this has been so far. And, it's just so tenuous, right? And so you
Yes.
hope that the way the United States is operating, and of course the other NATO countries, that they're able to, do the right thing and keep
Yes.
keep the world safe, because it's these decisions and these people and these men and women who are responsible for so much. And it could have gone a very different way, uh, right? Without the leadership we saw that ended World War II.
Well, that's very true. And that's a good reminder that having allies like Winston Churchill helped us. There were certain moments when he was very important in keeping us on the right trajectory. And Churchill, I'm just paraphrasing, he said something to the effect, the only worse thing than going to war is going to war alone. And I think the symbolism of those photo ops today in the White House should be a reminder to Americans we are better off with allies and strong allies than we are alone, especially with the president that just doesn't have the same experience of negotiating along these lines that some of these other people had that you just mentioned.
You've been so generous with your time, Mike. Can I ask you two quick questions from our viewers, really quick?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
I think you've sort of covered this, but someone is asking, please explain why NATO membership would ultimately be the best option for Ukraine.
Be the best option because it would be a credible security commitment. What the Ukrainians are afraid of is wishy-washy ones. There was one, for instance, in 1994. It's called the Budapest Memorandum and was signed between the United States, the UK, and Russia, and it was supposed to guarantee Ukraine's security. Well, guess what? The Russians, Putin, ignored it in 2014 when he first invaded Ukraine, and he ignored it again in 2022. So they worry that some kind of NATO light agreement will feel like the Budapest Memorandum, whereas they know the history of NATO in the same way that we've been talking about, that no NATO country has ever been invaded by Moscow, either during the Cold War or during that when Russia was an independent country. And I want to also underscore we've had this debate before. There were all kinds of naysayers at the beginning of NATO that said, including George Kennan, former ambassador to the Soviet Union, who said, this is going to poke the bear. We can't do this. This is going to be too provocative. He was against the creation of NATO in 1949. That turned out not to be true. Same when we brought in West Germany, 1955. Everybody said, not everybody, but lots of people said, oh my goodness, this is going to be too provocative. And it turned out to be stabilizing, not destabilizing. And then, the other waves, every time those countries have come in, Poland, On the Clinton administration, they said Poland, oh, we bring in Poland, we're going to go to war with Russia again. Didn't happen. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in the Bush administration didn't happen. When countries get into NATO, they feel more secure and they are more secure. And by the way, there's another piece that if Russians should think about. Once you're in the NATO alliance, you just can't go off on your own doing your own things. Ukraine cannot attack Russia. They would be constrained by being in the NATO alliance. So I actually think it's a security guarantee for both Russia and Ukraine and my evidence is, 80 years of history.
And the second question, someone's asking, can you please bring attention to the 20,000 plus Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped by Russia? We don't hear enough about this. And this is why you said that he's a convicted war criminal.
Yes.
Putin is, because of what's happened to all these Ukrainian children. Can you just mention that and explain to people who may not be aware of this, Mike?
Well, it's upwards of 20,000 Ukrainian kids that when the Russian soldiers came and occupied the lands, they took these kids to Russia and they have been indoctrinating them, basically trying to turn them into Russians, to different history, just speaking Russian, trying to get them to forget about Ukrainian and to eventually put them in families. Some of them already have gone to Russian families. That's what's going on. It's just absolutely outrageous. It's the reason why Putin is an indicted war criminal. These are against the rules of war, and it needs more attention. I'm glad whoever brought it up mentioned it. President von der Leyen did, by the way, the president of the European Union. Um, uh, Today in the press parade brought it up and she said, I have children. I think she has 7 children, by the way, Katie. I know that because one of them was my student in the spring quarter here at Stanford. So I met her mother at graduation and she already has grandchildren. And always, I hate to say it, but she was the one that brought it up, right? It's good she's in the room because she's thinking in those terms, and it got President Trump's attention. I was watching it. I don't know if he'll do anything about it, but I was really glad that she brought that up so that becomes an issue on the agenda for these discussions during the course of this day.
Are these orphans or did they just take them from their parents?
No, they're kidnapped. They were kidnapped, taken from their parents and grandparents.
Well, Mike, honestly, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us and everybody who's joined this conversation. Your perspective is so helpful. I think you explain things so well. You never make me feel as stupid as I sometimes feel when I'm thinking about this part of the world where I don't have much experience or a tremendous amount of knowledge. So, thank you so much, and maybe we can do a follow-up conversation when we figure out how this, as I mentioned, shakes out.
Absolutely. Katie, it's always great to be with you.
Thank
See you
you,
next
Mike.
time.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone. Hope this
Bye-bye.
was helpful. Bye.